This is supposed to be a marathon. I don't know exactly how long it will go. Rabbi Chait is leaving tomorrow morning for the States. So we wanted to get as much Torah out of him as possible before he goes. Our speakers tonight are Rabbi Israel Chait, who is the head of Yeshiva B'nai Torah, Far Rockaway, New York, and Rabbi Gedelia, who is a local and international teacher of the Hasidic movement, and especially Reb Nachman of Breslov, and who also lectures in personality workshops and things of that sort. People who are interested in watching them further, we have lectures of both Rabbi Chait and Rabbi Fleer in our video library. You can come in anytime and watch them, even buy them. What else? I guess the idea tonight, we had first thought of a debate, because last year Rabbi Chait spoke, as he wrote, his booklets are here, everyone can take them at the end, on his feeling of the supremacy of logic and thinking as opposed to feeling and emoting in Judaism. And Rabbi Fleer is generally specialized perhaps in people probing their feelings and relating their feelings to Judaism. But as we thought about it, the term debate may not be Jewish. I mean, many social institutions which we take for granted, like sport competitions and all, are really not Jewish. Why should one be fighting the other? We speak of the Torah as being composed of peace and truth. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said, if someone only stands on truth, there'll never be peace because we all see it differently. And if someone only stands on peace and wants to make nice with everyone, they'll always be afraid to express the truth. So there is a certain balance between truth and peace. And I don't think the concept debate includes that balance. It implies each one's out to defeat the other. But then when I thought into it more, it's not only that debate violates peace, debate violates truth. Because truth means that I always think maybe I'm wrong. People criticize Reb Soloveitchik for often changing his mind. That's because he kept looking into things new. And a person who won't consider that maybe he's wrong, maybe the other guy is right, forget the fact he's not just not peaceful, he's not truthful. So therefore I think we all sort of mutually decided that the concept of a debate is really not a Jewish concept. We'll discuss the issue. I'll just be basically moderator. Rabbi Chait and Rabbi Fleer will each speak a bit on the issue. They may disagree, maybe they'll agree. There's no, and certainly I'm sure both of them, two old friends, as we all age together, are really trying to find truth. And it may be that each will say, maybe I was wrong. So with that, I think a way to do it, we want to try to get in at least two, maybe three subjects. The first subject I entitled Hasidic Heart versus Lithuanian Logic. Rabbi Chait and I both studied in the Chaim Yeshiva, where logic was stressed, overstressed perhaps. And Rabbi Fleer also went to Musar Yeshiva in Arctic, but then he went into the Hasidic world. So I think a nice way to do it, about an hour for each subject. Say 20 minutes for Rabbi Chait, 20 minutes for Rabbi Fleer. And then people can ask questions. Maybe we'll each have 5 minutes feedback. We'll just play it loose. So without further ado, Rabbi Chait goes first, because in America they still dress well. We're sort of like Jerusalem, casual schleps. But so Rabbi Chait, please.
Thank you. Yaakov, and I would like to add to what Yaakov said, and that is in terms of the concept of debate not being a halachic institution. Even though scholars did debate, but the debates were always between the scholars. And I think that the concept of debate that we think of usually is that the determinant in the debate is the audience. And that really is something which is against the halacha, because halacha searches for truth, not for the appeal of an audience, the majority. So that's why when scholars argued, they argued among scholars, but they never called in people who weren't scholars to observe the debate and to determine who was correct, because it is really not, our system is really not a democratic system. It's democratic in the sense that anyone can become a scholar, but it is elitist in the sense that we only give heed to the person, to the scholar, the person that has knowledge, and not just to any person because of whatever way he may feel.
He was wise, he learns from all people.
Right. No, that's true, that's true. But at the same time, that's true, but at the same time, you have to know what to learn from each person. In other words, you don't just learn randomly. We don't say from the masses. The masses of people say they are the determinants of what is truth. I mean, the truth is determined by the scholars. There's no question about that. Okay. That's one point. In other words, the determinant. The second point also is that we have certain halachos, and I think this is what Yaakov was touching on, and that is that there are certain halachos that Torah, even the study of Torah, which is the most important activity, the greatest of all mitzvahs, Talmud Torah K'neged Kulam, still can be used in a way which would actually be detrimental to a person. And that's where the rabbis say that the person studies Torah to be critical of others in order to refute others, so then his life is completely worthless. Because what we are looking for in Torah is perfection, and not to demonstrate one's knowledge and one's sharpness, and to simply refute another person or embarrass him. And that's why the Talmud says that one of the worst crimes a person can do is to be miskaben b'klon chavero. In other words, to show that he is superior to his friend, and to catch another person. That's why the Gemara even says that a person is not permitted to ask his rabbi a question if he knows his rabbi can't answer it. Not permitted to ask the question. If you know that your rabbi can't answer you, you're not permitted to ask the question. So therefore, in Torah, as Yaakov mentioned before, the major concept is really perfection. Perfection of midos includes feelings of respect and reverence towards another individual, another human being, and the concept of debate is usually each one's out to get together at any cost, and that is not permitted by the law. So I think that Yaakov was correct when he set the stage that really this should be more of a discussion and a sharing of views, and if we differ, so then each person has a right to the question and to be simply gain the advantage of hearing different views and determining for themselves which particular view they prefer. I would the subject of the emotion and logic. To my mind, I really don't see any question. And as I met Rabbi Fleer, and he even said to me when we met in the square, he says, "I don't know if we really are arguing on an point or not." So the way I understand the concept in halacha of logic and emotion is simply that the determinants of which path a person should follow in life is made by the seichel the seichel of man, and the intelligence of man. The Torah, when the Torah describes the creation of man, so it says man is created in God's image. They call that in Hebrew the Tzelem Elokim, and the Rishonim say that this refers to his ability to comprehend, to understand, to partake of God's knowledge, and also his ability to exercise his free will, which is based on his use of knowledge and application of it to his personal life. For instance, the Rambam says, Maimonides states that the concept of the tzaddik, the great person, when he exercises self-control, which we call in Hebrew kvishas hayetzer, kovesh sitro. So the Rambam says kovesh sitro. He exercises control over his instincts. The Rambam is bidata, with his mind, with his intelligence. Now, this means that a person's mind must always be open. And if a person's mind is simply closed, just as certain, what psychologists call repression, certain things just not open to, this is not really a sign of perfection. Chazal say, for instance, the rabbis say on the passage, Al Kain Yomu HaMoshnu Bo Cheshbon, so it's really a reference to something else, but the rabbis often take a passage and they sort of hang an idea onto it. And they say that the Moslim, the rulers over here, is referring to the rulers over their own souls. And they say, Bo'u Cheshbon. And the rabbis say this means, come and let us make a Cheshbon is an account of Schar Mitzvah Keneged Afseda, Schar Avera Keneged Afseda. which means to say that a person should make an account. An accountant is a person that functions with his intelligence and with his mind. That's how he makes an account. And therefore, the person has to really understand an Avera. And it's not enough to simply say that something is wrong. I mentioned to someone recently what I felt was a shortcoming in the Musar yeshivas often, is the fact that in the Musar yeshivas what they do is they often tell you that something is prohibited, and then they will continue to heap many biblical statements telling you how terrible this is. If you speak against your fellow man, lashon hara is a terrible thing. You violate X amount of law, 13 law, whatever it might be, and then negative commandments. And then you're killing the person who's speaking about. They'll proceed to tell you how terrible it is by quoting the Chazal. I believe that that this method lacks because you have to explain to a person really what is wrong with lashon hara. Well, how does it harm an individual? Not simply tell him it's prohibited because the rabbi said it's a terrible thing and you should instinctively know that it's bad and therefore you shouldn't do it. But if the soul is something which we can deal with in some kind of a rational way, and the Torah tells us to do that, then we have to understand what is wrong with lashon hara. How does this take a person? How does this really reduce a person to a low level? When you explain to a person the concept, the fact that man has two parts to his nature. He has the instinctual part, which is the energetic part, and then he has his intellect, his ability to think. Explain to a person that in a human being, all the instincts are expressed in his verbalization. An animal has to stalk another animal. He uses his physical might. Man is a higher kind of creature, and therefore he expresses his instincts in his verbalization. So therefore, when a person speaks against another individual, tries to distort the reality concerning another person, then what he's doing is he's catering to the basest instincts in man's nature. And he's being reduced to a level which is perhaps even lower than an animal. In this way, he is using his energies rather than attaining the highest goals of knowledge and comprehension of God's wisdom and God's universe. He's being reduced to the lowest instinctual level. So I'm just using this as an example. When a person understands what is wrong in an avera, bo cheshbon, he has knowledge of it, it has a different meaning to it. And many times in the Musar yeshivas, they would tell you something. For instance, something comes to my mind. They would say, for instance, that there's a chazal, a rabbinical statement, that says, based on a pasuk, hal bein shinayim echalav, which means that the person's teeth is white from milk. So the rabbis, in their method, I don't want to go into the specific grammatics of it, but what they say is simply that white teeth is better than milk, which means to say that when you smile to a person, this is more important than giving a person sustenance. So Baalei Musar would continue to say, and you see how important it is to smile to an individual. If you find an individual in the street and he's starving and you gave him milk, you think, what greater thing could I do? No, that's not as important as smiling to an individual, which means if you refrain from smiling, it's worse than allowing him to perish in the street. Now, it sounds a little bit exaggerated. And many times the shortcoming of Musar is that they simply leave you at that point, and therefore you feel terribly guilty if you didn't smile to somebody as if you killed somebody. But they don't explain the idea. Now, what the rabbis are trying to point out is that a person is more of a psychological being than a physical being. It's more important to an individual. That's the concept they're trying to explain to you. That to smile to an individual, give a person recognition, is more important to him than food, really, because man is essentially psychological. So that's the concept that they're trying to express. But if you just take it in a literal way and you just heap a guilt attack on a person so that if he doesn't smile to someone, he's going to feel guilty, you aren't really doing the words of Chazal justice because you aren't working with the intellect, with the mind, and you're just trying to hit him from an emotional point of view. And the role of emotion in Judaism, it's not that Judaism does not hold from emotion. Emotion is very important. A person's relationship with God is based upon his ability to direct his emotion to God. But is, what is in the foreground is his knowledge of God. That is the prime mover. Maimonides states it to such an extreme that he makes a statement at the end of the laws concerning repentance, where he says that there is a direct correspondence, direct ratio between how much a person loves God and his knowledge of God. And you cannot exceed, his love of God cannot exceed his knowledge, which means to say that if a person simply puts himself in a room and just gets himself into an emotional fervor about how he loves God, this emotion really is not considered a love of God. It cannot exceed his intellectual perception. But of course, the intellect, the knowledge, and the appreciation of the beauty of God's wisdom, which he, insofar as we can understand it, is something which has to move the emotion. The emotion must be moved by this, and it's only natural for man. And that shows that the individual is a complete individual. He is reaching forth towards God with his mind and with his intellect. So if I were to be asked about the role of emotion, I would have to say that the role of emotion in Judaism is actually something which has to follow the mind first. Without mind, without the intelligence, we can't begin. We can't begin to understand what good is. We can't begin to understand what evil is. We can't begin to understand what God wants us to do. There is a halachic system, because we must use intelligence in order to unravel what he wants us to do, what he wishes us to do. The greatest scholar of the generation is not the person who is the most religious, but he is the one who has the greatest amount of knowledge. And that's why I met today with Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and I asked him a question upon which Rabbi Moshe had passed the verdict, and he said, I'm not going to, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein already stated, that's it. I have nothing to say. You have to follow his ruling, because he recognized that Rabbi Feinstein was a greater scholar than he is, and he had more knowledge than him. So the role of the scholar in Judaism has always been central. And I think there is no question that this is the way, the uniqueness of Judaism is how we differ from any other religion. Other religions have their righteous people and their religious people, but we have our knowledgeable people. And our scholars have knowledge not just of Talmud and of Torah, but if you look through the history of scholars, you browse through the encyclopedia, you'll be astounded to find out how much knowledge these scholars have of every area of knowledge that existed during their time. Insofar as emotion per se, I would just say that there's two, when we say emotion, we mean two different things. One is emotion as a source of energy. And here, the Torah prescribes that we use our instinctual energy should be diverted towards a higher goal, and that is the perception of God's knowledge. That's why Maimonides says that a person who is studying Torah is free from other disturbing thoughts, because his energy is being directed towards a higher goal. It's interesting that Plato's made the same statement. Plato in the Republic, when speaking about a philosopher, he said the philosopher is not interested in accumulating wealth, honor, or love, because he says man's energy is like a mighty stream, and once you divert the stream, you're going to lose the main power of the mainstream. So therefore, the philosopher directs all his energies towards wisdom and knowledge, and Torah maintains the same concept that the source of energy is one source. I think even the Kabbalists maintain this an allegory in which they give up the soul. It's interesting that Freud in psychoanalysis also discussed the concept of sublimation. He called it sublimation. It's interesting that these three areas agree in one basic principle, namely that the instinctual energy in man is capable of being used in a higher form, expressed in a higher form. That's one thing that we mean by emotion. That is certainly a goal of Judaism, is to use that energy for the highest possible activity that man is capable of. Then there's another meaning of emotion, which means specific emotions and specific feelings. And there, Torah does endorse specific feelings. We have a commandment to be happy on the holidays. But this commandment is based upon a concept. There's a reason to be happy on the holidays. Because on the holidays, we are thinking of the fact that we're home with Hashem, we're standing before God. And this makes a person happy. He's in God's presence. So he should be happy. So the emotion of happiness is mandated to us, but is based upon a concept that makes sense. And sometimes a person's supposed to be mitzabel, a person's supposed to mourn. It's time for mourning as well. But there's a reason for it. If a person mourns when he's not supposed to, Maimonides says he's considered a fool. So the whole prescription for the emotions is given to us by the Torah and is dictated by the knowledge of Torah. Once a person leaves these categories of knowledge and goes on his own, he is in a dangerous path, and he is liable to act in a way which is harmful, or in the less serious cases, in a way which is foolish. So this is basically what I would say concerning the area of emotion and reason. Does that mean?
Motion and reason. Right?
Motion and reason. I don't know if I use up 20 minutes.
We got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left? I forget to remember that.
It's like I'm in a very good position here between my intellectual capacity in my youth and the intellectual capacity of my later years. And it's nice to have them both together.
I'll take the 2 minutes back.
All right. By the way, the first thing, there is a difference here. We're all guys about the same age, and we're all people who are trying to explore the world through the Torah. But Rabbi Flair and myself have sort of come to it on our own. We don't come from observant backgrounds. Rabbi Chait does. But then when I thought about it, that distinction, according to Rabbi Chait, may not be a valid distinction. Because in line with this discussion, I've been asking different rabbis at Rosh Yeshiva, do you really think that your reason would bring you to Judaism if you weren't born that way? And in other words, would you be a religious Jew, a follower of the Torah, if you did not really born into it? And Rabbi Chait emphatically answered yes. And thank God I'm not from those Orthodox Jews who just go along with the way they're brought up. But my reason thought it all through, and I'm sure I would have done the same otherwise as long as I was in a society where I used my reason. Rabbi Shalom Gold, for example, answered, no, I don't think I would have. It's interesting. This is a little survey I'm doing, which I may publish the results of later. Go ahead.
There's 2 points in that. Because one point is, if you would have the knowledge that you have at this time, would you abide by that knowledge? The other question is, would you get to that knowledge? See,
or is it because the way you're born that you sort of went along with this knowledge?
Not that.
You don't agree with that? All right.
Reason that?
He said about himself.
That he
doesn't think he would have been a religious Jew if he hadn't been born into such a family, even though he's a great teacher.
They didn't mean that he might not have discovered it.
He doesn't think he would have.
That's a different
But
point.
he would have come to those conclusions, I think.
It is difficult to discover. I don't know if I would have discovered the ideas from the outside, because it's...
From your own mind, would you?
I can't, that I can't say, because a person, in other words, I must be thankful for the situations that I had. I was raised in a home where, for instance, the Rav was respected, so I went to study by the Rav. I mean, if I was on the outside, I don't think I could say that my chances would be close to,
By the way, Rabbi Soloveitchik explained the 2 scapegoats on Yom Kippur that way. He said that a certain element of where I stand on Yom Kippur is lots. He's born into the Soloveitchik house. Somebody else is born into a bum's house. Who knows if that bum had been born into the Soloveitchik house might have been brought to the Mashiach already. Excuse my Mashiach. And the other way around, who knows if Reb Soloveitchik had born into the bum's house, he might have destroyed the whole world, not just ministry Korban. So that's the message, the 2 goats, he says. A lot of it is lots. Okay, did you want to add
there's only one. And that is that I would say that that what we mean by knowledge, see, when a person reads, for instance, the guide for the perplexed, so there's a big problem because you have a translation here, and words don't mean the same thing today that they meant in the time that Maimonides wrote these things. Like, for instance, the way that Maimonides speaks about a scientist, an intellect, an intellectual, he doesn't mean what we conjure up as an idea of an intellectual. We think of an intellectual, a person who's a professor of mathematics, an intellectual. What Maimonides means is a person who is totally guided by reason in every aspect of his life, not just he knows one subject. So he's referring to an individual who subordinates his whole nature to reason. That's not what we today refer to as an intellectual or as a scientist. So the concept of Torah is that a person cannot attain knowledge in philosophical areas unless he is perfected. Because if he's not perfected, then his emotions are going to twist his mind, and as bright as he can be, as he may be, he will not be able to focus his mind. The mind is like a bright light. But the bright light is facing in a certain direction. You can't cast in the right and the opposite direction. So the emotions are very important in terms of not impeding man. If a person's emotional makeup is distorted, it's going to impede the power of his mind to be able to see the truth. And every imperfection and every wrong conclusion that a person draws is really based upon the fact that his emotion is distorting his ability to see the truth. But the perfected man attains his perfection essentially through the Tselem Elokim, the divine image, which means the unimpeded mind, which is searching for truth. That's the concept of the divine image.
Thank you. I think now we go from you shall not go after your eyes and after your heart, based on Maimonides, who's one of the diamonds. And to Rabbi Fleer, who I have a hunch will be more, you shall love the Lord your God with all your hearts.
Okay. Well, let's see. I basically agree in most of what's being, most of what Rabbi Chait said. I think if there is an area of disagreement, it's this kind of book or pamphlet, A Religion of the Mind. I start to wonder what emotional, irrational force pushes somebody to say that Judaism is a religion of the mind. I think that Judaism as a religion involves both a sense of the experience of God and the halakha. And obviously, the halakha is that which mediates the man and the experience. There cannot possibly be a legitimate Jewish experience of God without a halacha. And the halacha, as Rabbi Chait makes the point, is unequivocally logical, given the tenets that are accepted in the Talmud as logical. Not all of them are what you would call scientifically logical. Chaim Zimmerman, in many of his books, makes the point that, for example, the Midrash Bahem cannot really be considered logical in the mathematical sense. But nevertheless, there is a kind of logic that dictates the formation of halacha, which becomes the catalyst for Jewish experience. On the other hand, Maimonides, before he gets to the study of Torah, goes through Ahava and Yira, Nevuah, and all different kinds of means of recognizing and coming to an inner state that will then be susceptible to Torah and to Halakha. The Mishnah says, Im ein chochma ein yira, v'im ein yira ein chochma. If there's no such thing, there's no such thing as wisdom, unless there's fear of God, and there can be no such thing as fear of God without wisdom. And so there's a kind of circular argument here. And what is it that pushes one person to an understanding and appreciation for Torah? Causes a person to move in that direction. Certainly there's got to be an innate sense of godliness, which, according to Maimonides, comes from all kinds of things. It may come from examining the wonders of creation. It may come from the appreciation of the human emotion or the human intellect or all kinds of things. And so basically the purpose for mitzvahs is to cleave to God, ultimately to love God. And as the Ohar Chaim HaKodesh says on the verse, you have to Hashem Elokecha, you should love God, v'hoyu advarim ha'ela, Hashem Enochi b'tzavcha hayom alav. And these words of Torah that I have commanded you this day should be on your heart. Chaim says, listen, you can't say that knowledge constitutes love. For example, I know it says on every package of cigarettes that the cigarettes are bad for your health. Right? It's clear to me. You don't have to argue with me. I know cigarettes are bad for your health. But I smoke because I don't feel it. Okay? I don't feel that way. And so, basically, the Chaim says that the recognition of God is not in of itself love for God. Love for God is something that is transcendent to recognition. It's something that perhaps is monitored by recognition. There is definitely a ratio between what a person knows in Judaism to the Jewish experience of God. However, and here's, I think, basically where Rabbi Chait and I may possibly disagree in a very strong way. The question is, what are mitzvahs meant for? Okay, on one level, mitzvahs teach us a kind of awareness of God. They're ethical, they're moral. On the other hand, if we say that the reason for mitzvahs is to love God, to be dovak b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to cleave to God, then in a sense the mitzvah is the conduit. The mitzvah is that which mediates between the person and the experience. The mitzvah gives access to the experience of will. But the experience of will is beyond anything that is intellectually logical. I may know my mother loves me, but my experience of that love is when she embraces me. The fact that I know something does not make me feel it. And if the tachlis of Judaism is to experience God, the devaktabo, to cleave to Him, then I put forth that cleaving to God is not a matter of understanding God or understanding Torah, even though the understanding of Torah is a medium that helps us to cleave. The cleaving is something far beyond the experience of knowledge. Okay? In reading this book, most of the things here, see, if this book is to counter a kind of craziness, where a person says, well, there's no real need for Torah or for mitzvahs, I'm a good person, I love God, and I don't see what's wrong with that. If this book is meant to counter that kind of an attitude, well, great. But you see, the book subtly does something else besides counter that kind of attitude. In a way, it's misleading, at least in my opinion. For example, we have toward the end here, this is then the uniqueness of Talmudic Judaism. Intellect, usually the adversary of religion, is here its ally and stronghold. Even prayer, which is the service of the heart, has strict halachic formula as to how exactly it should take place. A mere outpouring of human emotion is not only invalid halachically, but may even involve serious infractions. The preamble to prayer is to know before whom you stand. Prayer must be preceded by proper knowledge of God. The halacha conveys to man correct notions about the Creator, so that when he prays to God, his mind is properly engaged. And there are some footnotes here. And so one of the footnotes leads us basically to a Gemara in Brachos, and there's a story there that concerns Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, and somebody got up to pray and was repeating the repetition of the Shemona Esrei and said, Hakel, Hagodol, Hagiba, V'Hanora, as is written in the Shemona Esrei, that God is Hakel, Hagodol, is the great God, Hagiba is mighty, V'Hanora, and he's awesome. And then he started to add a whole bunch of other things. And so Rabbi Chanina waited till he was finished, and then basically told him that, this is crazy. I mean, and now you're finished. Now that you added these extra adjectives, did you say it all? Is that that really describes what God is? Obviously, there are laws. You can't just go on in the middle of Shemona Esrei and add your own adjectives. In fact, had Moshe Rabbeinu in his Torah not referred to God as Hakel HaGodel, we'd have no right even to do that, because who could say anything in praise of the infinite? Okay, and so Rabbi Chait, in a sense, is utilizing that passage in the Talmud to tell us that you can't just say anything you want in prayer. Okay, if we look into the Ein Yaakov, into the Mefarshim, you see that the Mashor, for example, says that, well, since you already said, okay, those are the greatest praises possible. So anything other than that is already diminishing. It's like in the Gemara says, if a king has thousands of pieces of gold, and you compliment him for thousands of pieces of silver, well, you've done him a disservice. But the mashma from the mashah is, if you wouldn't have said, the implication of mashah is, if you wouldn't have said, to begin with, it would have been all right. But I wasn't satisfied with that, because that's my reading of it. On the other hand, when I look into it, I find that the Chedushei Hagonim says it openly. It says, the Nochas Rabbi Chanina, Hakel HaGodel, Ubetfila Mari. This is talking about formal prayer. Shein lahosef al ma shetiknu anshe knesses hagdola. You shouldn't add to the prayer that was made up by the rabbis of the Great Assembly. Aval ben levein atzmo lislam bar. If you were just praying by yourself, there would be nothing wrong to call God anything you want, as long as it wasn't against some formulation that was accepted or not accepted philosophically in Judaism. The point is, original prayer, if we take the position that the prayer is a mitzvah mid'oraisa to begin with, right? A Torah commandment was, according to the Rambam, any person could pray anytime he wanted, in any language he wished, and say whatever he pleased. And that is, if you hold tefillah as a prayer, as a Torah commandment, that is real prayer, is to say whatever you want in any way you choose at any particular time. And so the rabbis then went ahead and instituted formal prayer, Shachris, Mincha, and Marav, as we know it today. Well, one should not change from the formulae that they put down, but when you get into the notion of what prayer was meant to be originally, according to the Torah, there is no particular formula other than you shouldn't say things that are against Jewish concepts. Now, again, there are many things here. For example, I just throw out a few things. We find the pasuk in Yirmiyah, Aleph, and again another pasuk in Yirmiyah, Yud. And we say these psukim every single year when it comes the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur holidays and Slichas. We say things like, Ki b'chol chochmei hagoyim, b'chol malchusa man kemocha. Amongst all of the wise men of the king, of all the wise men of the goyim, of the other nations, and amongst all of their kings, who can compare to you, O God? Milo Yerucha Melech HaGoya, who is not afraid of you, doesn't tremble before you, king of the other nations. The Zohar, all right, the Zohar, the Hakdomas of Zohar, page Tes, Rabbi Losenberg Shimon asked the question, what kind of possible praise can there be in that for God? And it doesn't make sense. How can you say, amongst all the wise men of the Goyim, and amongst all of their kings, none can compare to you, O Lord. That's like saying, you know what, God, you're greater than the ants. It doesn't make any sense. All right, so the Zohar goes into a long explanation, but my point is that there are many expressions of one's love or understanding or recognition of God that comes straight from an emotional place, that are not necessarily all that rational. Okay? Prayer, in fact, is the avodah shebalev. It is the service of the heart. And so, where I'm agreeing strongly with Rabbi Chait again is that we need the precise halacha to mediate between what I would like to feel about God and the Jewish experience of God. Anybody can experience God, but what is it that enables us to have access to a primal Jewish experience of God? That is the mitzvot. And the mitzvot, the tachlis ha-mitzvot, are the purpose for the mitzvah is to experience the God. Now again, too, this is how much more time do I have?
We have another 5 minutes.
Okay, another thing that is pervasive in this pamphlet is the whole notion that, it's on, we don't have it, page 5, okay. How does the Talmudist resolve his problems if he cannot base his decisions on any inner divine intuition? He uses the same faculty the physicist uses in understanding the universe, his intellect. Just as a scientist studies nature, makes observations, and then proceeds to draw universal laws from these observations, so the Talmudist studies the data of the written and oral law, draws his universals from them, and then proceeds to utilize these principles in the resolution of his problems. Just as a scientist tests his theories against experimental data, so too the Talmudists test his theories by checking their results against Talmudic data from other areas that may be affected directly or indirectly. This is a caricature of what happens. This isn't at all really what takes place. First of all, there are many, many places within the Talmud where the rabbis rule according to majority. Now, if Hillel and Shammai have an argument in the Talmud, almost always Hillel is a genius and Shammai is a genius. And they're going to come up with self-contained, absolutely perfect arguments, but still be at odds with each other. So you can't say Hillel makes more sense than Shammai. That's ridiculous, right? In fact, if you asked Hillel, does Shammai make sense? He'd say, of course he does. And if you ask Shammai, does Hillel make sense? He said, of course he does. They're looking at something from different points of view and coming to completely different conclusions, but different logical conclusions. So what do we do in a case like that? Well, we go according to the majority. Now, do you think that the majority of rabbis who decide in favor of Hillel most of the time really, truly, deeply understand in their own minds that Hillel is more correct than Shammai? Probably not. They come to their conclusion simply on the basis of what people can live with easier. Okay? It's easier to live with. It's easier to live with Hillel, so we live with him. That's all. Which has nothing to do with this highfalutin scientific knowledge of who knows what that can't go wrong and must be absolutely precise. Plus the fact that when you get into the real halachas, that's just a side comment, but you will find that you have a machlokes in Shas, in Yevamos, and this is carried on into the Yerushalmi, about whether in general the rabbis can uproot the Oker Dovim in Torah, whether they can uproot something from the Torah itself. So, in the Gemara, you had the takana, and this is just one example, but you had the takana of Rabban Gamliel Hazokin, for example. Rabban Gamliel Hazokin, in his time, he was faced with a problem. The problem went something like this. The Torah says that in order to give a woman a divorce, you need the consent of the husband. The husband has to do it willingly. So now we have a situation where a man hates his wife. They've been living apart for X number of years, and he wants to really get her in trouble. So what does he do? He goes and he writes a real kosher divorce in front of witnesses, and he makes a shliach, a messenger, to go and bring the divorce to his wife. And he knows it's going to take the messenger, let's say, 2 hours to bring it to the wife. So the messenger walks out of the house, he waits an hour, and he calls 2 witnesses, and he says, I now nullify the divorce. All right. His wife receives the divorce. She's got somebody she's been waiting to live with. So she quickly gets married and lives with this other man, and he goes, I got you, you're really still married to me, right? Okay. So Rabbi Gamliel Hazoken says that I make a takana. A man is not allowed to divorce his wife and then nullify the divorce without the knowledge of the messenger and the wife. So a generation or so goes by, and you have a big machlokas in the Gemara, big argument. There was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi are both relatives, descendants of the old Rabbi Gamliel Hazaken. The question is like this: what if somebody didn't listen to the takana? What if somebody did it anyway? They went and did this whole number. They wrote a divorce, sent it to his wife, nullified it, and went against the takana. Now, is the woman divorced or not? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, look, as much as I like my Alta Zeta, still in all, I got to tell you, she's not divorced. Because the Torah says that you can only divorce somebody. The person is only divorced if the husband wants and wills it. And if we have proof he nullified the divorce, then she's not divorced. Rabban Gamliel says no, she's divorced. What's his argument? Because if she's not divorced, people will come and say that the Beis Din, the rabbis, have no real authority. And so this starts a big argument in the Gemara. And basically in the Talmud Bavli, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wins. She's not divorced. It's a dirty, bad thing to do, but what can we say? You can't uproot something from the Torah. If we look in the Yerushalmi, however, right, the Yerushalmi has no controversy about it. The Yerushalmi sides right away with the view of Rabban Gamliel and says that this woman is divorced. And if the Torah says different, let's uproot it. Let's not even try to get around it. And there is a Mishnah that the Yerushalmi bases itself on. The Mishnah says that if I'm going to give truma, if I'm going to give a certain amount to if I'm going to give a certain amount to the kahanim from the things that grow in my field, well, I'm supposed to give, let's say, olives and olive oil. I'm supposed to give grapes and wine. So supposing you get somebody who says, look, I don't want to bother to squeeze the olives and get the oil. I'll give you all olives and you make your own oil, kahanim. Or I'll give you all grapes and you make your own wine. So Hillel is a machlokas Hillel and Shammai. Hillel says, no good. If you can't cheat the kahanim, you can't put them through the trouble of having to squeeze their own olives. And he says, if you do this, if somebody gives a whole bunch of olives in the place of olive oil, that's not considered truma, and any person, even if he's not a kohen, can eat from this. This is against a law in the Torah, because the law in the Torah says you can't substitute one for the other. Based on that, the Yerushalmi sides unequivocally with Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. What I want to say with all of this, in summary, is that it isn't clear at all that our notion of Torah is scientific and absolute and there and written in stone in a way that human need, human consideration, menschlichkeit, doesn't impinge on that. Emotionality, how we feel about something, how it affects other people, plays a very strong part in the rendering of the halacha, and it isn't as though the halacha is like 2 and 2 is 4, and that's it, and there's no way to argue it. That's where I'm up to right now.
At this point, we owe Rabbi Chait 3 minutes extra, and before we get each maybe 5 minutes to reply, then questions from everyone, pass the cups and the speakers can have a drink.
Where's the ice?
The ice is there. While the speakers have a drink, we wait for Rabbi Chait's reply. I would just, maybe we get back to the focus of the discussion, because the subject of discussion was not Rabbi Chait's leaflet, even though I left some here for people. And he didn't really speak about that. And in the introduction to his leaflet, he mentions he's trying to put in sharp focus the intellectual side of Judaism, and he's simply not putting it in balance deliberately, if I understand you correctly. So the subject really is emotion and logic of Judaism, and this particular booklet, as I see from his preface, is simply to put in sharp relief the intellectual side. Hey, I would be inclined to think that the principle that the rabbis can take something out of the Torah is expounded by Abarbanel and others, I have it on one of the parsha sheets, I don't remember which, is that they understand the underlying principles of the Torah. It's in Albo, for example, and they understand that sometimes the particular technical working out of the law will go against those underlying principles. So you still come back to underlying principles which are intellectually understood, as I see it. It's just that it's sometimes in the process of carrying out the law, you forget the purpose of the law. It doesn't mean it's an emotional purpose. I mean, it can be God's will that there be a certain social order, that there be no human distress. It's not that I feel sorry for the person. And so that's my offhand reaction. I remember once being with a great sage who argued like Rabbi Chait, just to go a little bit the other way, and he was arguing passionately that intellect is the main thing in life, not emotion. And I said, what's saying that? In other words, the desire, we come, I think, a problem that you might want to address, is that ultimately the passion for intellect itself is an emotion, not the logic. There's nothing logical maybe telling me. And then the second question, I keep thinking of Rabbi Chait's remark, watching us discuss such issues. I said, this is the guys playing ping pong. Like women have to keep the world going and having an innate sense of what things are about, without all this dialectic and abstract ideas and deductive reasoning. And therefore I would raise to Rabbi Chait, maybe it is fine, that's the other question. Where do women come into this? I raise it to both of you, because if people like Maimonides, who you cited as sort of a model for understanding Judaism, which I would attribute his intellectual bias to the fact that he deprived of emotions, and his mother died, his father hated him, and so forth. Shashot HaKabbalah, 1600s writes about it. So women who Maimonides certainly discourages from thorough intellectual study of Torah. He said if they want to, all right, but he's really against it. Most Jewish tradition never pushed women to learn Talmud. So how are they supposed to get the Torah then? So I tend personally to somewhat go along with Rabbi Chait, but I might say that that's the way it is for men, not for women, who have the intuition to sense God's will, which men perhaps lack and need to do through a formal process. Anyway, now I'll have to drink. Rabbi Chait, 5 minutes. 8 minutes, excuse me. You're owed 3 minutes. I have a Yankee side to me a bit slow.
Really?
You've got 8 minutes.
Okay. I have to address the points that Rabbi Flair mentioned, and I don't remember all of them, but let's start with the last one. As far as the last one is concerned, I simply disagree. I don't believe that any posek ever said that the reason why he's postulating this way is because he has empathy or feelings of sorrow, and because of the fact that any Gemara ever says that they came to any conclusion based upon the fact that this would be the best thing for the society, or that it would be kinder to posture this way. I don't think we'll find any Gemara in the posek ever says such a thing. I totally disagree. I maintain Psak Halacha is based totally upon proofs, based upon rationality, and based upon reason, and that's every response that we have is always inducing of evidence to prove the point. Never because of the fact that we have to posture this way because we feel sorry for so-and-so. That is not the way Psak works. It's just a matter of anyone that is there longer and knows the area, I think, has to agree with it. Insofar as the idea that how can there be an argument between two great thinkers like Hillel and Shammai, I don't think this is very mysterious. There's no mystery. You have arguments in physics between great physicists. You have different views insofar as the way physicists understand the universe. There's nothing mystical there. The reason is because each person's mind has to function according to their own intellectual intuition. And the concept in halacha of machlokes is that each person has a right, if they are a scholar, to their intellectual intuition. We don't believe in common intuition, we believe in intellectual intuition. In other words, in medicine, if you didn't know if something cannot be proven, halacha would say that a good physician's answer would be more reliable than a person in the street. Why? Because the person in the street doesn't have knowledge. But the physician has knowledge of an area, and a person, when he has knowledge of an area, has a certain intuition. Now, in the area of intuition, people are not the same. And that's why you have arguments. You have arguments between Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr about the universe. These are two great physicists. There's nothing mysterious about it. It simply stems from their own intellectual intuition about the phenomenon. You always have arguments in science and in every area of knowledge. There's no such thing as an area of knowledge where there is no argument. Torah is no different in that respect. It's the same. The only difference in Torah is that there is such a thing as psak halacha, which Rabbi Fleer mentioned, which means that we use certain ways, certain methods of determining the practice of the halacha. One of them, Rabbi Fleer mentioned, is rov, majority. Now, majority does not mean that the minority is wrong. It simply means we practice and follow the majority. It doesn't mean that the scholars who were in the minority gave up their opinion. They maintained they were correct. You could have one brilliant person who will be more in line with the truth than hundreds of fools, as we know. So there could be one individual that is more intelligent and has arrived at the truth. Nevertheless, the Sanhedrin has to go according to the majority because we must have objective criteria. It does not mean that the person who is in the minority, that his idea is inferior. He's allowed to maintain his idea and think he's correct. He simply can't practice it. Now, the area of intellectual intuition is precisely, is exactly what is meant by an argument, by a machlokes. That is what it means, that each person is entitled to their own intuition. The Allah never tells a person how to think. That's why Rambam says there's no such thing as telling a person how to think. When it comes to a matter which is not of Allah, which is a matter of philosophy, arguments among the sages, there's no such thing as Allah. You can't say you must think this way. You can't say you're wrong because 20 people think you're wrong. There's no such concept. You can't dictate a person how to think. You can dictate to them how to act because you must have a uniform type of practice. You can't have people doing one thing and other people doing another. You break up the whole law system. So I don't see anything mysterious about it. Insofar as did the rabbis understand Hillel when they paskin like him? Yes, they absolutely did. As a matter of fact, the Gemara says one of the reasons we don't paskin like Rav Meir is because the scholars could not understand him. He was too abstract. And since he was so abstract, they couldn't follow him, so they could not use an unknown in making a decision. So when rabbis actually determine whether they want to follow one view or another, they do understand it. They absolutely do. Let's see, what else?
Prayer.
Yeah, prayer, I disagree again. It is not true that a person can pray anytime he wants, any way he wants. It would be brachos. There's a concept of brachos and vatalos without a question. And if you're going to tell me that the original system
Blessings which are
involve a serious infraction, one of the Ten Commandments according to our minds, which is you shouldn't mention the name of God in vain. So there are very strict halachic requirements as far as tefillah is concerned. For instance, before a person requests something of God, you must have the proper praise. You must praise God, and in the proper way. And the fact that it must be done in the proper way shows you that there are all ways. The Talmud says in Shabbos, for instance, a person is in the middle of a Talmudic discussion. There's a case where a scholar was in the middle of a Talmudic discussion, and he turned away from the discussion to pray because he didn't want to miss his tefillah. Time was passing by. And the Talmud says that the other scholar said to him that your tefillah is an abomination. Your prayer is an abomination. Why? Because he who turns his ear away from knowledge, even his prayer is an abomination. And that's a statement from Shlomo HaMelech, from King Solomon. So there certainly are specifics insofar as how and when a person can pray. Even though the person may be filled with great emotional fervor, he wants to pray this moment, he doesn't want to miss mincha. But that was wrong for that scholar. I'm not telling you this is not psak, by the way, because it's only for...
It's not a ruling.
It's not a ruling here because it's only for a person who's on a certain level where his Torah is his main preoccupation in life. But I'm just giving you that as an example to demonstrate that even a person who wanted to pray because he didn't want the time to go by without him praying properly, and he was criticized because his prayer was considered an abomination because he turned away from the knowledge of Torah. And that's a statement by made by King Solomon. So I disagree completely that the person just praying random how he wants in any way he wants. The other point that was mentioned was with regard to other feelings that a person can use in the love of God. All I can say to you is, if you listen to this person in Rambam, that the first one, you can say whatever you want, but just read the Rambam and just see what he says. It's not what he says. The Rambam, Maimonides states that he states clearly, he says, what is the way of loving God and fearing God? And he gives a specific method. When a person contemplates God's wondrous actions, creations, and he sees God's infinite wisdom, then immediately he feels a desire to move towards the Creator, and he is filled with awe. The fear and the love are two sides of one coin. This is not just the Rambam, by the way. Rashi states on the passage quoted by Rabbi, that is the Shema, and these words will be upon your heart. So Rashi quotes the rabbis that state very clearly. The Sifri states that the only way for a person to love God is through study of Torah. Through this, you come to recognize the one who said the universe should come into existence. So I maintain there is only one way. I don't believe that there is another way. Other emotions are alien. That's precisely why Maimonides says that there is a direct ratio between a person's knowledge and between his love of God. If there was another field, other methods, there wouldn't be this direct ratio. Because I could have less knowledge, but have more of these other emotions. So therefore, according to Maimonides, it is impossible to justify that position. If you wish to justify that position based upon other scholars, fine. And I am saying, by the way, it is absolutely impossible. Your question of logic is just an emotion, is not true either.
The desire for love.
Desire for love. Now, desire is always an emotion.
Right.
But the reason why we abide by logic and reason is not because of emotion, it's simply because of experience. Because we know that the way you fix the car is not through a swami, but through the mechanic. Things work in a certain method, in a certain manner. And the way we understand the universe is through the mind. And it is the same part of man. Now, of course, there's one point on logic. You could get into an argument as to what is logic. They say, well, this is scientific logic, that's not scientific logic. We get into an endless debate. I would merely say the following. When I say logic, when I say reason, I mean the part of the human being that is being used in certain performances, like the study of science or the study of geometry. Or it is the same part of the individual. So I'm not going to get involved in what is modern logic, old logic. All I am saying is that when the Talmud is logical and scientific, I don't mean scientific that it's the study of physics. I mean it is using the same part of the human being that is used to contemplate the rest of the universe. And that is the divine image of God. There's nowhere, as we say, for instance, in our prayers, God created the universe every night, and every morning we say, Lord, says, you made this all with wisdom. There's no difference between the contemplation of the wisdom of God as we see in the universe and the wisdom of God as we see in the Torah. There's specifically because it is done with the same component of the human being. You want to call it mind, whatever you want to call it, but it's the same component. That's why there's a blessing that we have when you see a great scientist. You must make a blessing. You must say, blessed Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, creator of the universe, who has given of his knowledge to flesh and blood. So God's knowledge, God's infinite knowledge, was made available to us through one part of our makeup, and that is the part that perceives knowledge. And that's the part which the Rambam says is the way of reaching God. That's the part, that's the way to love God. Nothing else. Anything alien is simply not a part. So I disagree. I just simply disagree with that.
It's Rabbi Fleer's turn. I might just briefly comment. If I understood you correctly, your point is that the desire for logic is not an emotion because we've somehow found that logic leads to good results. And I would assume good is defined by true, well, that things function well, as you put it. which is like imply it does basically rest on the emotion that we like things to function well.
No, not that we like
A,
it.
B.
We see that it works. We see that
No, we do not. We see
the plan takes
it's not
off.
really my point, but
The plan
yeah,
takes
and we
off.
saw that
It's taken
science
off.
and logic led to the most intelligent and powerful empire, Germany and Austria.
That's why it's
and they would have been much better off without
Because they didn't have, no. See, now you're using science in a modern sense, not in a
Logic,
modern,
intelligence,
not
understanding how
logic.
the world works.
No, you're wrong, because they did not have any logic as to how to live properly. They were not logical. All their logic was only a tool to an instinctual evil desire. And there was no logic which they used in understanding that this desire is evil and that this is a harmful way of
Is desire
existing. So
evil
there was
because
no
of logic or
application.
because of feeling?
No. It can be logically demonstrated that this desire is something which is harmful and detrimental for the person involved and for all others. It can be demonstrated. In other words, they didn't use any reason when it came to ethics. There was no reason. That was the mistake. The mistake was that they didn't use any reason in that area.
Gedelia, I just don't quite hear
Let
that.
me just make a few fast comments.
By the way, excuse me, do either of you know, in the question of half a slave and half a free man, do we rule like Shammai or Hillel as to whether he must be free so that he can marry? Hillel says you don't have to free him. Let him stay unmarried.
They would go to Zer on a Shifra Kananis that you should free her rather than to be Mabazima.
So they went, would that prove your point, that they went like Shammai, because Shammai was the nice guy
There
there.
are many, listen, I can't understand that we have a principle, the Darke Noam principle.
All the ways of Torah are pleasantness and all its paths.
We have,
That's true.
and we have a machlokes. I mean,
Except when you read his book with
the
it.
Gemara in Sukkah talks about why you shouldn't walk around a gigantic S road. It might be because it's not pleasant. you have
It's pleasantness and
you have a basic Gemara that about how many laws the rabbis kind of modified in order that there shouldn't be any agunas. We accept the testimony of one witness, whereas the Torah says you should primarily have two witnesses, etc., etc. They nullified at least a half a dozen laws, if you look into the Gemara, making it so that you don't have women who are stuck, unable to remarry because their husbands disappeared. And the Gemara says, well, why did we do this? Because we don't want women to be stuck. That's a kind principle. It has nothing to do with anything that's super logical. It's just that the Gemara says we don't want there to be too many agunas. That's all. So we did away. We modified many laws. We came to. Also, you have a principle that you have a principle in halacha that there are many halachas that halacha v'yein marden came, that this is the halacha, but we don't do like that because that the congregation, the Jewish people will not be able to put up with this law, even though this law is rational and this law is ideal. But if we lay it on people, they're not going to like it, so we don't. So I don't see where the Torah isn't kind. And doesn't consider emotion.
That's an intellectual.
That's not what I said.
But it's based in it's based.
I said a machlokes is not though. I said Tzaka is not. I didn't say there are any takanos which were made for the purpose of people. Of course, the takanos.
What we're saying is that the halacha in many instances is formulated in conjunction with human feelings.
No, it's formulated. The halachas takanos are formulated for people. There's no question
That's
about
right.
that.
Oh, that's all
But
I'm saying.
but that's a different point than understanding a debate. When you have
Well,
machlokes,
because
an
if
argument
you-
or a tshuva,
From
it's
this book, Rabbi Chait, it would seem to me that if it isn't hardcore, objective, scientific reasoning, throw it out. Now, I understand that you understand that it's not so.
No, this is no.
Excuse me 1 second. There are a bunch of seats. If people could sit back here on this bench if you want to come forward. There's no problem. So let's take a second. And there's
Speaks about, there are certain laws in Tefillah, and you can't say Barachot Levatala, 100%. But again, Tefillah Diaraita, the prayer that comes from the Torah itself, like the Rabbi says in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah, it basically was prayed by anybody when he wanted to pray. Now later on, when we had a concept of Torah, so then we have laws. Torah takes, believe it or not, Torah in certain instances takes precedence over Tefillah, etc., etc. But basically, the spirit of prayer, as originally was meant, was a person could pray what he wanted, when he wanted, and so on. And we learned basically from people's mistakes. So basically, what's his name said Avram Avinu, Baruch Avram L'Kel Elyon, and he made a mistake, so the kahuna was taken away from Malki Tzedek and given to Avram. So he learned from a mistake, but nobody. So he made a mistake. So there's things to learn. But he said Avram's name. He praised Avram before he praised the Kohen. But the point is, Malki Tzedek was a big person, so he made a mistake. But these are things that we learn as we go along. The notion of prayer basically is an expression of the heart. And Rahman Libaboy, God wants the heart. I think I want to end with this, at least end this part, with one little story. They say that the great Rabbi Shapiro, he was going to open up in Europe the Yeshivas Chacham Lebrun. And he was the first person to come up with the concept that the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, the Lithuanian Jews and the Hungarian Hasidim, whatever, they should all merge and come into one yeshiva. And he's going around, by the way, the Mesifta Torah V'das later on was supposed to be modeled after that concept. And so you had very Hasidic Rebbes in there, very Litvisher Rebbes. So Rabbi Shapiro is going around raising money. He comes to a rich man. And the rich man says, look, you're a great person. You're asking for money. I'll give you. But Rebbe, I'll tell you, I don't understand. What could the Hasidim and the Misnagdim have to offer each other when they study Torah? So the Rabbi Shapiro was supposed to have said like this. He said, there's a Gemara that there were 80 Talmidim to Hillel HaZaken. Hillel HaZaken had 80 Talmidim, 80 pupils. And the smallest one of them was Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. And how great was Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel? When he would study Torah, the angels would come to listen to him. And so if a bird flew overhead, it would be burned up by the angels that were present. So one day, a chassid and Misnagid are sitting there, and they come to this place in the Talmud, and they're reading this story about Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. So the Misnagid says to the chassid, he says, when you read this thing, what do you think about it? So the chassid says, what kind of question is that? Could you imagine the godliness, the gedlichkeit, the greatness, the power? Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, a physical, finite, mortal human being, and yet he learns Torah and he attracts such spiritual forces in his vicinity that you can actually see birds being burned up overhead. Wow, I mean, it just blows me away. Then the chassid says to the Misnagid, he says, and you, when you read it, what do you think about it? He says, well, I'm trying to figure out who pays for the birds. Is it a direct action or an indirect action, right? So Rabbi Shapiro said, the truth is, we need them both. I don't believe you can divorce the Jewish religion from its spiritual content, or that spiritual content is to be taken lightly. I think any more than you can divorce the spiritual content from the halachic, from the halachic rationale in the Torah that cannot be taken lightly. But I believe that the reason for the halacha is to access the spiritual. And there's a lot more to say about this, but I believe that when we have the experience of God's will, the Kabbalist right, Ein Tam B'Ratzon, that when the experience of will is beyond reason.
That was really a story for the birds. As an American, or maybe at the Harvard Institute, the reaction to the story is, why did the bird deserve it? You feel sorry for the bird. You feel sorry for the bird in that story, right? Okay. I think at this point, we still haven't done the issue of how women fit into this whole picture. I think it's more a problem on Rabbi Chait's side, since women are discouraged from the sort of learning which he says brings you to love of God. And because the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs only says that the Torah brings you to the love of God, but in his Mishnah Torah he does not say the Torah brings you to the love of God, only the study of nature. My attempt to reconcile it is because women also can participate freely in the study of nature. And the Rambam may have been aware of this problem by moving into Torah, Our women's schools get public out. It's just my guess. There's some various opinions. Anyway, perhaps it's really not a question of Rabbi Flair because he, I think, includes those components like intuition, which are primarily feminine, and other elements of the feelings and hearts in the system. So, and that may be how women get to it. But maybe just 1 minute for Rabbi Chait, from your standpoint, to deal with that problem. Given, even though we may not agree with it completely, but given the traditional, especially your hero, the Rambam's opposition to women's learning, how would you assume that the women then achieve the same thing, or maybe they don't? Footstools or whatever.
My opinion is that there are two aspects to Talmud Torah. One aspect of Talmud Torah is the obligation to study Torah and to pass it on to the next generation. That is an obligation that falls upon the man, not upon the woman. She's exempt from that obligation. But insofar as the appreciation and understanding of Torah, that even a woman is not exempt from. As a matter of fact, Maimonides himself mentions it in the laws of the Yisrael Torah, in the 4th chapter. That's the fundamental principle of Torah, 4th chapter, last law, where he talks about whether he speaks about the fact that a person's study of Talmud and law should precede his study of metaphysics. And he says one of the reasons is that everyone is capable of understanding that. Katan, Gadol, Ish, Yisha, Ba'alev, Rochev, Ba'alev, Katzah. Because everybody can understand halacha. No matter what he mentions specifically woman. He mentions everybody. He mentions man, woman, child, everyone. So you see that he held, that Maimonides held clearly that a woman can understand halacha.
The law, rather than the analysis of the law.
No. He's talking about the law. He's talking about analysis of the law.
Yeah, but I'm talking about he discouraged them from their Talmud.
Oh, was I? Insofar as the obligation to carry on the Torah, a person learns for his own knowledge and own edification. He also learns because he's obligated to study Torah to carry on to the next generation. That's an obligation a man has, a woman does not have. Insofar as her perception of Torah, the ability to understand halacha, she is on a personal level, she is in the same situation as a man, and she has to pursue the knowledge of God in the same manner. The same way. And there were great women who were leaders in Torah. Devorah was the greatest scholar in her generation, and the Chachomim, the wise men, used to ask her how to paskin halacha. And she wasn't a part of the Sanhedrin, because a woman can't be part of the officially part of the Sanhedrin for reasons I don't think this is the time for it right here, but that's a different matter as to why a woman is not a part of the Sanhedrin. It has nothing to do whatsoever with a woman being inferior. That idea is completely erroneous, completely false. Such conclusions are drawn only by people who don't know the halacha system. But insofar as her ability to love God, she has the same obligation, the same perfection as a man. Yes.
How do you interpret women, servants, and children are exempt
from Talmud Torah?
From Talmud Torah.
That's right. From the obligation of Talmud Torah, insofar as it is a formal chiyuv for a person to make sure that the Torah is given over to the next generation. As a matter of fact, if you continue in that Rambam, you'll see where he speaks about...
You shall teach your sons to speak in them.
No, what I'm talking about...
And the woman is not obligated to learn.
Well, I'm talking about
to teach her son.
Right.
Because everyone who's obligated to learn has to teach.
That's right.
She's not obligated to learn or teach.
She's not obligated. There's no obligation, formal obligation of Talmud Torah per se. And the reason is because...
But he discourages it also later.
The reason is because over here he's discussing Talmud Torah so far as it is a mitzvah, commandment, carried to the next generation. The proof is, in the succeeding halachas he mentions, the fact that if a man can study Torah and his son can study Torah, so then he comes first. But if the son is more intelligent, then the son comes first. Why? Because here we're dealing with not just studying for your own sake, but studying insofar as perpetuating Torah. That's why the Rambam talks that way. But insofar as a woman's ability to perfect herself and appreciate God's knowledge through Torah, she has the same obligation as a man. It's impossible to say otherwise because she's involved in Avos Hashem, the love of God. And since the Sifri and Rashi says that is the method, and the Rambam says it in the Sefer Mitzvos, so then by definition she has to do it. She just doesn't have the formal obligation insofar as the Chiyuv of Talmud Torah and perpetuating the system. That falls upon her.
Maybe this last one. Woman, can you read my eyes? A woman who,
Ish lo notן יש לו שכר, אבל אין שכר איש. That's right. Because
a
that's
woman
another...
may translate for it.
There's a general principle that anyone that does not have a formal obligation and does a command, it was an argument among the scholars. So it's an argument. If a person is, the rabbis tell us that there was a great scholar who was blind. So at first, he was very happy to hear that anyone that's blind does not have to keep the Torah. Why? Because he said, then I'll get more reward because I didn't have to do it and I did it anyways. He said, but then later I learned, no, that a person who has an obligation to do something gets more reward. And Rishon explained, it was an argument on the scholar, and Rishon explained it because of the fact that when a person senses an obligation and feels that he has to comply with his obligation, it makes it more difficult psychologically, and also it means, and it is also true, that a person that is under an obligation is functioning not just for himself, but because of God's will insofar as perpetuating the system. And because he's functioning on that level, besides the level of his own perfection, he is into a different dimension and he has more reward.
I think so.
And that's why the mind is... Yes, go ahead.
I think the problem that Yaakov raises is really very explicitly in the
Excuse me,
Rambam.
wait, I want to read one more line from this paragraph of Rabbi Chait's here. I'm not so much a Rambam person.
Then they were.
But here, this is something you have in common. Okay. Then the Rambam goes on to say, and even though she has reward, the woman who learns, right? Sivu Chachamim, the rabbis commanded that a man should not teach his daughter Torah, because most of the women, their intellectual capacity, their dad, is not geared or aimed or set toward learning. But they mix up words of Torah, I would say, to words of nonsense, right? Because of the paucity of intellect. Correct translation? That's good. Right? And the rabbi said, everyone who teaches his daughter Torah is as though he taught her something which will mess her up. All right? When is that said? In the oral law. This is the distinction that my mother makes. But the written law, he shouldn't teach her ab initio. But if he did it, it's not like he taught her nonsense. Would you comment on that?
I would say, in my opinion, I say like this, that in a general way, that a woman's nature is such that so far as studying Torah and arriving at a psaka, as follows. And there's two types of Torah. There's Torah insofar as the perception and knowledge and appreciation of Torah. That's one thing. And then there's Torah insofar as passing judgments and making decisions. And insofar as the latter is concerned,
teaching your daughter
yes,
Torah, nothing about her making decisions.
Okay. No. So you're making a mistake. Because when he's talking about the oral law, he's referring to the Gemara, and there was a style at the time of the Gemara. When we learned the Gemara, which means to say that every time a Gemara was learned, it was learned exclusively for the purpose, not just for understanding, but also for the purpose of psak halacha.
But he's
That was the
not
purpose.
understanding.
What the Rambam is discussing over here is a statement of Chazal, which is that Noshim Daitan Kalos, which is what you're referring to. Now, Noshim Daitan Kalos means as follows. It means